Hello. Today I'm going to talk about my regional experience that I had over this past weekend. I want to start off by thanking our leadership that helped organize this event. So Cody, Anne-Marie, Shavam, Vioplume, and all of the Ann Arbor Ypsilanti community of trainers. We pulled together really hard to get a good venue for this event and set it up so we can have a good time with all of our participants who came from all over Michigan, Ohio. I think we had somebody from Indiana, and we had multiple people come out from Canada as well. So huge shout out to all of our leadership. Second, I would like to congratulate Jimmy Banks for going undefeated for this tournament. He did a really good job. And I would also like to congratulate our runner-up, Kevin, actually a friend from past competitive games that I've played as well. So congratulations to you, Kevin. Good job for getting runner-up. So for my tournament experience this past weekend, I got a tie for second. So I tied with Kevin, and he beat me through tiebreakers. So we were the only two to go 5-1. So what I would like to do is kind of analyze my team first and then give you a little bit of a play-by-play of how my matchups worked throughout the day. So first, I'm going to cover my team in two sections. First is my substitutes. My first one was Melmetal. Through my practice, I found that Melmetal was an excellent flyer, and I kind of was predicting there to be some type of flying teams, as I found out early on through testing that an Altaria Skarmory team was actually pretty good, as long as it had good coverage or good counter coverage for anything that would stand in its way. So Melmetal ended up being my choice because it was an excellent had excellent flying coverage, and also does a lot of damage to Bastiodon too in a no shield situation. My second runner-up was Lantern. He was one of my MVPs because he was the biggest substitute for Azumarill in any matchup where I felt like a team was going to be more reliant on using Skarmory and Azumarill. If I wanted a bulkier electric user as well, since Melmetal's not the bulkiest, Lantern also filled that role. And then the last substitute that I had on my team was Skuntank. And I would like to give one honorable mention to Quagsire, as my original team used Quagsire for flying coverage and also served as a pseudo counter for Bastiodon. But with the previous weekend's regional performance of Valor Ash, I was predicting a lot more teams to be using the Glade Haunter combo, or at the very least, just solo Haunter as a substitute on a team, or even a primary user. So I decided to use Skuntank as my counter, as Crunch does a lot of damage versus both of them. And anybody that has used Skuntank on their team would know that it is a perfect Pokemon for sandbagging. The purpose of Skuntank is to just come in and put a lot of damage on a Pokemon that's going to hurt your team, in this case, Glade and Haunter, and it rather forces the shield or forces a lot of damage, or they don't know the damage output from Skuntank, and they're more than likely going to lose Pokemon. So it served very well for my team, especially because there was a lot more Haunters than I had originally expected. And then the last part of my team was Medicham, Skarmory, and Azumarill. Azumarill, of which I decided to go with Bubble, Play Rough, and Hydro Pump. Now, Medicham, Skarmory, and Azumarill I dubbed as the Trinity, as I felt that was the strongest core team in general to use, so I was expecting most teams to be using it. I did think that it would be about 50 to 60% of teams would use the Trinity, but after analyzing the final results, out of 34 users, or out of 34 participants, there was 26 users of the Trinity, which came out to a whopping 76% of the playing field used the Trinity core, which once again is Medicham, Skarmory, and Azumarill. So it was a little bit higher than I was expecting, but that was fine. We came prepared, and that's why we had Lantern on our team. Now, I was expecting the Trinity. I was expecting most teams to be using Lantern, as I would figure if you also thought the Trinity was going to be good, you definitely knew that Charge Beam Lantern was a very strong mold breaker for the Trinity. I also was expecting a lot of Whiscash, as anybody that knows that Lantern is the biggest mold breaker for the Trinity, that Whiscash had the best matchup against Lantern, and also has an okay matchup against most of the other Metamon as well. The last couple things that I was expecting is that Venusaur usage was going to drop significantly, as it ended up becoming more of a liability on most teams through my own personal practice. And I thought Haunter and Glade would rise in popularity thanks to Valorash's performance the previous weekend. My team's personal weakness was to Alolan Raichu through practicing, but I was also not expecting a lot of teams to use Alolan Raichu, which in this case only 2 participants used Alolan Raichu. So I wasn't too worried about it, and I kind of called it right. There wasn't a lot of people that were using it. A couple other things to note was that Probopass's released the day before. I didn't think a lot of people were going to use it, but surprisingly enough, as we can see just with a quick glance on the teams, a lot of teams were using Probopass, a decent amount of them. It's a good pseudo Melmetal role, and has a couple other niche scenarios where it actually performs a little bit better than Melmetal. But it did rise a lot in popularity for this event. And the other thing that caught me off guard is that we saw more Lantern counters more than we saw more teams that were using Lantern as a mold breaker for the Trinity, which I thought was a little bit surprising. What that means is that less teams were carrying the Trinity and Lantern as a mold breaker than teams that were carrying the Trinity and then using a Whiscash or Quagsire as a counter to teams that were bringing the mold breaker, which I find a little bit interesting. So, we're going to kind of talk a little bit about my matchups round by round. So, my first matchup for the day was against Piscivore, and my apologies if I mispronounce any of your names. Piscivore's team was Haunter, Azumarill, Skarmory, Medicham, Tropius, and Melmetal. In this matchup in particular, Skuntank was my MVP. I knew that it was good counter towards Haunter. It does a lot of damage against Azumarill and also does a lot of damage on Tropius. And that's exactly how my games played out. I caught a Tropius on a switch where I could bring in my Skuntank. My Skuntank, obviously Skuntank dies in a lot of these scenarios, but as I already had previously mentioned, he is meant to sandbag. So he comes in, he does all the damage that he can on Tropius. He may force one shield. So then when my next guy comes in, I have full shields, they're down a shield, and I can more than likely counter the last 2. So Skuntank pulled out very well in my round 1. My round 2 was against Sand Pirate. Now, as we can see, the number one thing that stands out against his team is the Alolan Raichu. I knew my team was really weak, but I was hoping that he wasn't going to be able to see how weak my team was to Alolan Raichu right off the bat. He beat me 2-0. His game 1, he did not lead with the Alolan Raichu, but I still lost. In my game 2, I thought I could pull it out because he led with the Alolan Raichu and I led with Medicham. And he opted to let the Alolan Raichu die, which I was really shocked. So I kind of figured, okay, this is my chance that I can pull a 360 on this game and hopefully win it. but his last two guys were hard counters against my last two, so we couldn't pull that out, and we took our first loss early on in the 6th-round tournament. So our next matchup was against Siryu, who was using Azumarill, Medicham, Bastiodon, Skarmory, Venusaur, and Melmetal. And in this particular matchup, we caught a Venusaur on a hard switch when I was able to bring in Skarmory. And anybody knows through testing, if Venusaur comes in on a hard switch and Skarmory comes in on it, that you're basically going to lose the Venusaur for nothing, and then you're going to have to deal with the slightly healthy Skarmory, and Skarmory is already pretty hard enough to take down. So it was really unfortunate for him, that matchup. My round 4 was against my buddy Redford Novak. We've had the privilege of playing in a couple of tournaments in the Grosse Pointe area. This is the first team that I came across that was a Valor Ash clone, which I was expecting to see a lot more. But thankfully for me, I did have a fair amount of practice against this team, so I kind of was a little bit prepared. I knew Skuntank, once again, was going to MVP this game, which it did. And actually, me and Red had practiced earlier in the day, and I think I know that he knows that that Gallade is very strong against my team as an opener, and especially if you have Medicham in back as a closer, because if I have to hard switch out on a Gallade, and then I have to worry about it in the end, and a Medicham if my Skarmory goes down or my Azumarill goes down, because I may or may not bring both of them, it's going to catch me in a really bad situation. But thankfully for me, I was able to play Skuntank properly, and it did pull me out through that game. But good games, Red. Thank you for that match. And my next opponent was Hooked on Onix. And as we could see, Hooked on Onix also had a had the Valor Ash team as well. He was using Medicham, Azumarill, Melmetal, Skarmory, Haunter, Gallade. So once again, we already knew how to play it. This particular game, Game 3, he had already not led Gallade as his first guy both games. And since Gallade is such a strong option against my team as a lead, I figured if he was going to use Gallade as a lead at all, he better be using it Game 3 if he didn't do it Game 1 and Game 2. So I decided to hard call Skarmory as a lead for my first time in the tournament. It paid off because he did decide to lead Gallade, and he had to hard switch into, I can't even remember what it was. It was just something where, like, if it was a Azumarill, I brought in the Lantern. If he brought in the Haunter, I brought in the Skuntank. But unfortunately for him, I called my lead right, and it paid off. And then my last round was against Kevbob, and this match in particular, as we could see, his team is Lantern, Gallade, Medicham, Probopass, Whiscash, and Azumarill. Skarmory is an insanely good lead against this whole team. We already know it's really good against Whiscash. It beats Azu in the beats Azu in the lead spot, destroys Medicham, destroys Gallade. Medicham's a good matchup against Skarmory as a lead, but it's not a favorable one. And it does pretty well against Frostless as well. So I decided to hard lead with Skarmory both games. Not only that, but Medicham is insanely good against this team. It completely destroys Whiscash. It completely destroys Probopass. So my strategy for this matchup in particular was just to stick with the Trinity, not make any substitutes for any of my guys. The Trinity was insanely good against this team because I was freely be able to lead Skarmory, and anything that he had to force to switch. My Skarmory already has a good matchup against his entire team as a lead, and then whatever he decides to switch out, if he decides to switch out, Metacham and Azumarill have an amazing coverage against the remainder of his team. So I was able to pull out the win round 6, so that ended my tournament experience being 5-1. I ended up in 3rd, and that was due to tiebreakers. So my experience over the weekend was phenomenal. Once again, huge shout outs to Jimmy Banks. I didn't get a chance to play him, or Kayvon, Kevin. I didn't get to play either of them, but first place and runner up. That's awesome performance. Good job, guys. Thank you to the A2Y community of trainers. We got great leadership there, really professional people, very pleasant people. So please come check us out. Come to some of our future tournaments. It was a great time, so stay tuned as I do more of these analysis videos for my teams in the future for other cups. And, yeah, until next time.